Okay, let's unpack this. We have got quite a stack of sources here, all focused on what has to be one of the biggest shakeups college sports has ever seen.
Absolutely. We're talking about the House v. NCAA settlement.
Right. And if you thought college athletes were just, playing for the love of the game and maybe a scholarship, that whole era, it's fundamentally over.
Gone. The NCAA's 100-year model of amateurism.
Hmm.
It's basically history now.
It's a huge shift.
Truly seismic. Judge Claudia Wilkin just gave it final approval. We're entering a totally new era.
And the core change is just massive. For the very first time, universities, the schools themselves can directly pay athletes. We're talking potentially millions of dollars.
Million.
It's a
Yeah.
complete game changer. So our mission here in this deep dive is to try and cut through all the complexity.
There's a lot of it.
Definitely. We want to figure out exactly what this settlement does, trace the history, how did we even get here?
Yeah, look at the path.
And then dissect the key parts of the agreement itself, what's actually in it, and look at the massive ripple effects. For athletes, school.
Even the pro leagues. It touches everything.
Right. So think of this as your shortcut to understanding the completely new rules of engagement in college athletics. We'll use these sources as our map.
And it is complex, partly because, it wasn't like a light switch flipping. This is really the culmination of decades of pressure, legal pressure, market pressure, pushing back against that old idea of amateurism.
Right. For, over 100 years, the NCAA stuck to this idea. Athletes are amateurs, compensation is mainly scholarships, maybe cost of attendance.
Arguing it protected the educational mission, the love of the game.
Yeah, but all the while, college sports just exploded into this multi-billion-dollar industry.
Built squarely on the labor of these athletes who, saw very little of that actual revenue themselves, directly.
And that tension, right, the huge money versus the limited pay for the players. That was the crack in the foundation.
Exactly. And the legal challenges just kept widening it until the whole thing basically shattered. The first really big one was O'Bannon v. NCAA.
Oh, yeah, the video game case, essentially.
Right. It challenged the NCAA using athlete names, images, likenesses, their NIL in games, broadcast, whatever, without paying them.
And Judge Wilkin, the same judge who just approved this massive settlement, she was central to O'Bannon too, wasn't she?
She absolutely was. Her ruling back in 2014, it basically said the NCAA's rules stopping athletes from getting paid for their NIL, that was an unlawful restraint of trade under antitrust law.
Antitrust law. So about fair competition preventing monopolies.
Exactly. She found the NCAA was like stifling the market for athlete NIL. Her ruling allowed schools to cover the full cost of attendance, and while her initial idea of letting them set aside maybe $5,000 a year in trust funds didn't ultimately stick on appeal,
Right, that part got overturned.
it powerfully established that athletes did have a commercial interest in their own NIL. It really opened the door.
Paved the way for what came next. Which leads us to NCAA v. Alston. That went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, a huge one. Unanimous decision in 2021. The court said NCAA limits on education-related benefits, things like laptops, tutoring, internships. Those limits violated antitrust law.
And Justice Gorsuch's opinion, didn't he call the NCAA a cartel?
He did. He used the word cartel.
Uh-huh.
And then Justice Kavanaugh wrote a separate opinion, a concurrence, that was even more forceful.
What did he say?
He basically put the NCAA on blast, signaling that there are other restrictions on paying athletes, like direct pay for play, looked legally really shaky under antitrust law, extremely vulnerable. That was a massive turning point. It gave lawsuits like House so much more legal ammunition.
Okay, so the courts are chipping away piece by piece, and then the states just decided to jump in themselves.
Right. California kicked it off in 2019 with the Fair Pay to Play Act, first state NIL law, and that just triggered this avalanche.
A whole bunch of states followed suit.
Yeah, but the problem was they were all different. It created this confusing, frankly chaotic patchwork of rules. Depending on what state your school was in, the NIL rules could be totally different.
Which the NCAA tried to manage with that interim policy in 2021.
Tried being the operative word. That policy did finally let athletes make money from their NIL, endorsements, social media, all that.
But still no direct pay from schools for playing.
Right, still that hard line against pay for play.
Yeah.
Any deal was supposed to have a quid pro quo,
Yeah.
you do something specific for the money, an appearance, a post.
But how it played out was messy.
Yeah, chaotic is a good word. Especially with the explosion of these donor-funded groups, the collectives popping up everywhere, pooling money, often with the clear goal of attracting or keeping players at a specific school. Regulation was loose, inconsistent, it was wild.
So when you line it all up, O'Bannon chipping away, Alston cracking the foundation, the state law mess, the NCAA's reaction, this House lawsuit demanding actual revenue sharing, it almost feels inevitable, like a logical trajectory.
It really does feel like that.
Yeah.
It was driven by those same antitrust ideas, basically recognizing that athletes create enormous economic value in this giant industry. The NCAA kept fighting these battles in court instead of, finding a proactive solution.
And kept losing.
And kept losing, each loss digging a deeper hole. So this settlement, it feels less like the NCAA chose this path and more like the courts basically forced this overhaul. And honestly, that state-by-state chaos, it made some kind of big, maybe federal-level solution, either this settlement or maybe even Congress stepping in, feel almost inevitable.
Okay, so that brings us right to the settlement itself. Approved by Judge Wilkin. She called the relief extraordinary. What's actually in this thing?
She did call it extraordinary.
Wow.
And her history with O'Bannon and Alston definitely gave her a deep understanding here. It's important to note, too, this settlement wraps up not just House, but two other similar antitrust cases, Hubbard and Carter.
Okay.
So there are really two massive components. First, there's the backward-looking relief,
Yeah.
the back pay for former athletes.
Right, that huge number I keep seeing, $2.8 billion, is that right?
That's the figure, yeah. Somewhere between $2.7 and $2.8 billion. It's a massive fund set up to compensate potentially tens of thousands of former Division I athletes.
Who played when?
Between 2016 and 2024. The argument is that during that time, the NCAA's rules improperly restricted them from earning money from their NIL or other athletic services. This money is supposed to be paid out over the next 10 years.
Wow. Okay, $2.8 billion over 10 years. Who foots that bill? That's enormous.
It's shared. The NCAA itself is ponying up a big chunk, maybe around $1.1 billion, using its reserve funds and future revenues.
Okay.
Then the big conferences, the Power Five, well, Power Four now, mostly they're contributing a significant amount to around $664 million combined.
And the rest? Other D1 schools?
Yeah, the other Division I schools contribute indirectly. They'll see reductions in the money they usually get distributed from the NCAA each year, like from the March Madness basketball tournament revenue.
So why? Why agree to pay out almost $3 billion?
Because the alternative was potentially way, way worse. The sources talk about looming fears of bankruptcy. If these cases had actually gone to a full trial and the NCAA and conferences lost...
Which seems likely after Alston.
Right. The potential damages could have been astronomical. Antitrust law allows for treble damages, meaning a court could triple the amount of financial harm found. So instead of, say, $7 billion in damages, it could become over $20 billion.
$20 billion. Okay, yeah. $2.8 billion sounds less bad.
Exactly. It's still a massive hit, but it was a strategic calculation to avoid a truly existential financial catastrophe.
Okay, so that's the back pay. But I know there's been some controversy, some serious criticism about how that $2.8 billion is actually going to be divided up among the former athletes.
Yes, definitely. Considerable criticism is putting it mildly. Formal objections were actually filed with Judge Wilkin before she approved it. The proposed plan heavily favors football players.
How much?
They're projected to get something like 75% of the total payout.
75%? Wow.
Yeah. And men's basketball gets around 15%. That leaves just 5% for women's basketball players and only 5% for all other Division I sports combined, men's and women's.
Wait, 5% for everyone else. Swimming, track, baseball, softball, everything.
Everything. And that's triggered huge concerns about gender equity under Title IX.
Right. Title IX, the law about equal opportunity in education, including sports. Okay, that seems problematic. So that's the backward-looking piece. What about the future? The forward-looking model for current athletes. This is where the direct pay comes in.
This is the big shift for day-to-day operations moving forward. It sets up a framework allowing schools for the first time to make direct payments to their current athletes. It's basically a revenue-sharing system.
Tied to playing sports for the school.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Tied to participation and performance, though the exact distribution methods might vary.
When does this potentially kick in?
It could start as soon as the next academic year, 2025-2026. So July 1, 2025 is a target date.
Do all schools have to do this?
It's technically an opt-in system each year. But realistically, schools in the major conferences, the Power Four, they're widely expected to participate, maybe even required by conference rules. It'll be table stakes for competing at the highest level.
Okay, and there's a limit, right? A cap on how much each school can pay out directly.
Yes, that's a really crucial part of the deal. For the first year, 2025-26, that cap is initially set at around $20.5 million per school.
Where does that number come from?
It's calculated based on average revenues in the power conferences. It's roughly 22% of the average school's take from things like media rights, deals those huge TV contracts, plus ticket sales and sponsorships.
And that cap isn't fixed forever.
No, it's designed to go up each year. The floor for the increase is 4% annually, so projections suggest it could be somewhere around $33 million per school per year by 2035.
So a school gets, let's say, $20.5 million in year one. How do they decide which athletes get how much?
That's largely up to the individual school. They have discretion on how to allocate that capped amount across their various sports teams and among the athletes on those teams.
But we can probably guess where most of it will go.
It's widely expected that football and men's basketball, being the major revenue generators, will receive the lion's share of this direct payment pool. Although schools do still have to navigate Title IX requirements for overall equitable spending.
Okay, so athletes are getting paid directly by the school. Does this mean they're finally considered employees of the university?
That is the million-dollar or maybe billion-dollar question the settlement carefully avoids answering definitively. Crucially, no. Under the terms of this settlement, the athletes are not classified as employees.
So how are the payments structured?
The plan is for them to be treated likely as payments to independent contractors. So athletes would probably get a 1099 tax form, not a W-2, or potentially structured as royalties for the use of their name, image, and likeness by the school, but explicitly not employee wages.
Okay, but wait. If you have all these universities who are definitely competitors for athletes agreeing together on a cap for how much they can pay those athletes, doesn't that sound exactly like?
Like price fixing or wage fixing. Yeah, that's the huge potential paradox here.
Which is usually a big no-no under antitrust law, right?
Generally, yes. Agreements among competitors to limit what they pay for something. In this case, athletic talent is typically prohibited. Pro sports leagues have salary caps, sure, but those are usually negotiated with a players' union through collective bargaining.
Which gives them a labor exemption from antitrust rules.
Exactly. But college athletes here aren't employees under this deal, and they don't have a union negotiating this cap. So the cap, while intended maybe for cost control or competitive balance,
Could itself be illegal under antitrust law.
it's a serious vulnerability. The Department of Justice has already raised concerns. Legal experts widely agree this cap could be challenged as an unlawful restraint of trade. So the settlement aims for stability, but this piece might actually create new legal battles and instability down the road.
Wow, so the fix might be broken from the start. Okay, wild. What about the NIL deals we've all gotten used to seeing? The deals with brands, local businesses, those collectives, do those just go away?
No, not at all. Athletes can absolutely still make money through third-party NIL deals, endorsements, appearances, social media, sponsorships. That's all still on the table.
And does that money count against the school's $20.5 million cap?
No, and that's really important. Third-party NIL earnings are separate. They do not count towards the school's direct payment limit.
Okay, so you have school pay and outside NIL pay. How are they planning to regulate those outside deals now? Because as you said, the previous system was kind of the Wild West.
They're trying to bring some order to it. The settlement sets up a new oversight mechanism. Any third-party NIL deal worth more than $600 has to be submitted through a central clearinghouse.
A clearinghouse. What's it called?
It's being called NIL Go.
NIL Go. Okay, and who runs that? The NCAA? The conferences?
Neither. It's being administered by an outside firm, Deloitte, the big global accounting and consulting firm.
Deloitte's. Okay, interesting. So what's Deloitte's job with these NIL deals?
Their main task is to review these deals and assess them for fair market value, or FMV. They'll use some kind of multi-factor process. The sources mentioned maybe 12 different factors they'll look at
And the goal of checking for fair market value is?
to try and make sure these are legitimate deals for the athlete's actual NIL value and not just, disguised payments from boosters funneled through a fake deal to get around the school's payment cap. Trying to prevent sham transactions designed purely for recruiting or retention.
That sounds incredibly difficult to police accurately, especially with booster collectives still out there.
It's going to be extremely challenging. How do you objectively determine the fair market value for a niche sport athlete's local endorsement deal versus a star quarterback's national campaign? The NCAA does retain the right to prohibit deals with what they call associated entities, which seems targeted at stopping direct coordination between schools and booster groups.
But separating legitimate NIL from pay-for-play inducements.
Very tough line to draw. There's a lot of skepticism about how effective this FMV review will really be in practice and whether it can truly stop creative workarounds.
Okay, so we've covered back pay, direct school pay, and third-party NIL. What about the teams themselves? Does this change roster sizes or scholarships?
Yes, another really significant change is in roster management. The settlement does away with the old sport-by-sport scholarship limits.
Hmm.
The famous 85 scholarships for FBS football.
Okay, so what replaces that?
Hard roster size caps for each team. So instead of limiting scholarships, they'll limit the total number of players allowed on the roster. For FBS football, the number being discussed is around 105 players total.
And scholarships within that cap.
Here's the interesting part. Within that roster cap, schools can now offer a full athletic scholarship to every single athlete on the roster if they choose to, and can afford to.
So potentially more full scholarships overall.
Potentially, yes. Instead of 85 full rides in football, you could have 105, for instance.
So why is this causing concern? I've heard worries this could kill off walk-ons or hurt athletes who rely on partial scholarships.
That's the major fear, especially for non-revenue sports. Think about sports like swimming and diving, rowing, track and field. They often have huge rosters, way over 100 athletes sometimes. Many of those athletes are walk-ons or receive only partial scholarship aid.
Right.
If you impose a hard roster cap, let's say it's 100 or 110, and schools feel pressure, maybe for competitive reasons or Title IX reasons, to offer full scholarships to everyone within that cap, well, those spots previously held by walk-ons or partial scholarship athletes could just vanish.
So thousands of participation opportunities could disappear.
That's the concern. Thousands across the country, particularly hitting those non-revenue and Olympic sports hard. There's a grandfathering clause, so current athletes on rosters won't immediately lose their spot. They can stay until their eligibility runs out.
But for future athletes?
For future recruiting classes, yeah, it can mean significantly fewer opportunities to participate in college sports, especially outside football and basketball.
Okay, let's just try to sum up this shift because it's a lot. We're going from a system that was mostly scholarships, some other limited benefits, and then this chaotic, unregulated third-party NIL market.
Right.
To a new world with massive back pay, capped direct payments from schools, plus third-party NIL deals that are now supposed to be regulated by Deloitte for fair market value, funded in new ways with power shifting more to the conferences and these new hard roster caps instead of scholarship limits.
That captures it pretty well. It is a
Yeah.
complete fundamental restructuring, a paradigm shift. And the ripple effects, as you said earlier, are going to be felt absolutely everywhere.
Okay, let's dive into those ripples then. First, just the sheer financial reality for athletic departments. This is a huge new expense line.
Huge. That direct payment cap starting around $20.5 million a year and going up, that's a substantial new line item that athletic departments somehow have to fund.
Where does that money come from?
Well, it's got to come from somewhere. It means reallocating money from other parts of the budget, almost certainly cutting expenses elsewhere, and getting really aggressive on generating new revenue.
So, higher ticket prices, more expensive hot dogs.
You can probably count on it. Squeezing more out of media deals, raising ticket prices, concession prices, merchandise, maybe new fees like a talent fee added to tickets, maybe even tapping into student fees more. We're also hearing about some universities looking into spinning off athletics into separate legal entities just to manage the finances.
And don't forget the back pay contribution.
Right. That adds another layer of strain because part of how the NCAA and conferences are funding their share is by reducing the annual distributions that schools normally rely on. So budgets are getting hit from multiple angles.
Which brings us back to that fear about non-revenue sports. With this kind of financial pressure, are they sustainable?
This is honestly one of the biggest anxieties across college sports right now. A significant area of concern is how experts are putting it. The worry is that the money needed for those big direct payments in football and men's basketball, the revenue drivers will inevitably have to come from cuts to the non-revenue sports, the Olympic sports.
Many of which already lose money.
Exactly. They're often subsidized by football and basketball revenue as it is. We're already seeing what might be early warnings. Cal Poly just announced they're cutting their men's and women's swimming and diving programs, and they explicitly cited the financial impact of this settlement as a major factor.
Wow. So it's already happening.
And that has implications beyond just the schools. Think about the U.S. Olympic teams. College programs are the primary development pipeline for so many Olympic sports. If those programs get cut,
It hurts Team USA down the line.
potentially yes, and add the roster cap impact, fewer spots overall. Even if schools could offer more full scholarships in these sports under the cap, the big question is whether they can actually afford to, given all the other financial pressures.
So this seems destined to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots. in college sports, right? The big power conference schools versus everyone else.
Absolutely. It almost certainly exacerbates the competitive imbalances.
Yeah.
Wealthier schools, primarily those in the Power Four conferences, with huge media deals, massive donor bases, they'll have a much greater capacity to fund these direct payments and attract top talent.
Making recruitment even more about the money.
It effectively formalizes a pay-for-play environment, even if they avoid the term. The transfer portal, which is already incredibly active.
Yeah, the Wild West part two.
It could become even more transactional. Players potentially moving year to year based purely on who offers the best direct pay and NIL package.
So, does this settlement actually achieve one of its supposed goals, which was to bring some stability to college sports?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? NCAA President Charlie Baker talks about it creating a pathway to begin stabilizing things.
But you sound skeptical.
Well, a lot of experts, lawyers, economists, even athletic directors are pretty skeptical. They actually predict new kinds of instability because of all the big unresolved issues.
Like the employment question, the cap's legality.
Exactly. The ongoing employment status fight, the antitrust risk of the cap itself, the Title IX compliance headaches, the certainty of more lawsuits down the road. Many see this settlement less as a final solution and more as a necessary stopgap measure.
A way to stop the bleeding from the existing lawsuits, but not a long-term cure.
Something like that. A way to avoid immediate bankruptcy, maybe, but not necessarily a stable foundation for the future.
And who's actually in charge now? Does this mean less power for the NCAA?
Definitely seems that way. There's a clear power shift happening, moving away from the NCAA headquarters in Indianapolis and towards the major conferences,
Right.
especially the Power Four, who are defendants alongside the NCAA.
So the conferences are running the show more now.
They're taking on primary responsibility for designing and enforcing the rules around this new revenue-sharing cap and overseeing the third-party NIL regulations.
And they're setting up a new organization to handle that.
Yes, the plan involves creating a body, tentatively called the College Sports Commission, or CSC. Its job will be to monitor compliance with the payment cap, enforce the rules, and work with Deloitte and that NIL Go clearinghouse.
Any idea who might lead it?
There's been talk about Brian Seeley, a former executive with Major League Baseball, potentially being tapped for a leadership role. It signals a move towards a more professionalized oversight structure.
And the NCAA's role shrinks.
Their role in policing compensation and benefits seems likely to diminish significantly. They'll likely focus more on running championships, setting academic standards, health and safety rules, things like that, less about the money rules.
If this new commission, the CSC, is created by the conferences, can it really police its own members effectively? Isn't there a conflict of interest there?
That is a huge concern people are raising. How independent and robust will this new enforcement body really be? Will it be more effective and consistent than the NCAA's enforcement division, which faced plenty of criticism itself? If the CSC and Deloitte's FNV reviews aren't perceived as truly independent and tough, there's a real risk that this new system could just become, an even more unregulated Wild West than what we saw with the initial NIL rollout. Different rules, same problems.
Okay, let's really focus on some of the biggest legal and ethical landmines still out there, things this settlement doesn't fix. You mentioned Title IX again regarding the back pay.
It's absolutely critical and potentially explosive. The Department of Education has been clear. Title IX applies to NIL compensation. It requires schools to provide substantially proportionate financial opportunities for male and female athletes based on their participation rates.
And that back pay split 90% plus to men seems hard to square with that.
Extremely hard, which is why formal objections were filed. And looking forward, how schools choose to distribute the new direct payments under that $20.5 million cap will face intense Title IX scrutiny too. If football gets a huge chunk, what does that mean for women's sports funding? It's incredibly complex and potentially litigious.
Okay, Title IX is a big one. What about the elephant in the room? Athlete employment status. The settlement says they're not employees.
Right, it carves that out explicitly. They're independent contractors or receiving royalties.
We're now talking about schools paying athletes potentially hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, directly tied to them playing sports for the school. Doesn't that look, walk, and quack like being an employee?
You've hit on arguably the most significant unresolved issue, with massive implications. The settlement sidesteps it, but many legal experts argue that this new system of direct, substantial payments tied to athletic participation actually inadvertently strengthens the legal arguments for classifying athletes as employees.
Because the economic reality looks like employment.
Exactly. It starts to look a lot more like a salary for services rendered. And why does this classification matter so much? Because employee status unlocks a whole suite of labor rights.
Like minimum wage,
The
overtime,
workers' compensation if they get injured, the right to organize, form a union.
and collectively bargain, like pro athletes do.
Precisely. The National Labor Relations Board has already issued some rulings suggesting certain athletes could be employees. There are ongoing court cases, like Johnson v. NCAA, focused specifically on this. It's almost guaranteed that future legal challenges will argue these new payments prove athletes meet the legal test for employment. This is probably the focal point of future legal challenges.
So the amateurism era is dead, gone after 119 years. That's the seismic shift.
It truly is a fundamental break from the past, moving towards a much more professionalized model. For many athletes and advocates, this compensation is long overdue recognition of their value in labor.
But it also brings up those philosophical debates.
Yeah, about the impact on academics, on the idea of the student-athlete,
Yeah.
the balance between education and commercialism. Does it become all about the money? Or does the financial security actually help athletes focus by alleviating hardship? There are strong arguments on both sides.
And the financial pressure on the schools themselves, particularly outside the Power Four. You mentioned Cal Poly. It seems brutal.
It's intense. Remember, many athletic departments outside the Power Four operate on budgets that are smaller than that new $20.5 million annual payment cap.
So they might not even be able to opt in, or it would cripple them.
It puts them in an incredibly difficult position. Plus, they still have their share of the back pay bill to cover, likely through reduced NCAA payouts. And Title IX still applies. If they do find money for football and basketball pay, they have to find equitable support for women's sports, which might mean cutting men's non-revenue sports or other things. It really points towards an increasingly stratified and unequal landscape, a bigger gap between the haves and have-nots.
And without a single federal law governing all this, couldn't we just see states passing new laws to try and give their schools an edge in this new pay environment, like undermining the settlements rules?
That's the real risk of legal arbitrage, yeah. Without a uniform federal standard, you could see states trying to create more favorable rules for their universities. Maybe different NIL regulations, different payment structures. It could perpetuate instability. The settlement tries to create a national standard, and the NCAA is telling schools to follow the settlement over conflicting state laws. But that creates obvious legal tension.
Which just adds fuel to the fire for calls for Congress to finally step in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It intensifies the pressure for some kind of federal legislation to create uniform rules and maybe, just maybe, grant college sports some limited antitrust protection, which they desperately want but currently lack.
It also sounds like running an athletic department just got way more complicated. You need different kinds of people now.
Oh, completely. The required skill set just expanded massively. Sources talk about needing roles like general managers, similar to pro sports front offices.
People who understand contracts, finance, tax law.
Exactly. Specialists in contract negotiation, financial planning, tax implications for athletes receiving 1099s, data analytics to manage the cap and roster values, sophisticated compliance officers for Title IX and NIL rules. It's a whole new level of professionalization required within the athletic department itself.
One more potential snag. That Deloitte fair market value review for NIL deals. Could that accidentally hurt athletes in smaller sports?
That's a potential downside people have flagged. If the benchmarks Deloitte uses for fair market value are mostly based on deals for high-profile football and basketball players, they might not accurately capture the legitimate value of an athlete in, say, women's volleyball or college wrestling, who has a really strong but niche following.
So it could unintentionally suppress their earnings.
It's possible. If the system isn't flexible enough to recognize unique types of NIL value outside the mainstream sports, it could inadvertently undervalue or even block legitimate deals for those athletes.
Okay, let's shift perspective a bit. How does all this upheaval in college sports impact the professional leagues that draft these players?
It changes the whole dynamic of the talent pipeline and how athletes think about their careers.
Yeah.
The big factor is money, obviously.
If you can make good money in college.
Right. If you can earn substantial income through direct school pay plus NIL deals while you're still in college, maybe you don't feel the same pressure to turn pro immediately just for a paycheck, especially if you're not projected to be a top draft pick with a huge guaranteed contract right away.
So some players might stay in college longer.
It seems likely. If your potential college earnings, say, as a star quarterback or a basketball player, are comparable to, or maybe even better than, what you'd make in your first year or two in a pro league's developmental system or on a rookie contract. Why rush? We saw reports about Cooper Flagg's potential NIL at Duke maybe being more than his estimated first-year NBA salary.
Wow.
So yeah, less urgency to leave early purely for financial reasons for some athletes.
Which means the pros might get players who are older, more developed.
Potentially more mature, maybe more polished. Pro leagues will have to adjust their scouting, maybe their developmental league strategies. Athletes coming in might also be more savvy about managing money, their brand, contracts, because they've already been doing it.
But there's that flip side concern for the Olympics again.
Absolutely. If non-revenue college sports really do face significant cuts because of these financial pressures, that directly threatens the pipeline for many U.S. Olympic teams that rely heavily on college-trained athletes. That's a major worry for the USOPC and individual sport governing bodies.
Does the money athletes make in college affect what they expect to make as pros?
It certainly could. If an athlete has documented earnings of, say, $1 million a year in college through direct pay and NIL, their agent is absolutely going to use that as leverage when negotiating their first pro contract.
Pushing rookie salaries up.
It could definitely put upward pressure on rookie wage scales or signing bonuses, especially in leagues where those aren't strictly locked down by a collective bargaining agreement. The lawyers in the House case even made the argument that college athletes may have the ability to receive the same percentage of revenues as professional athletes, which, while maybe aspirational now, sets a benchmark that could influence future pro CBA talks.
So is college sports becoming more of a direct competitor to pro leagues now? Or is it just a much richer feeder system?
It's really blurring the lines between the two. Top college programs are going to operate much more like professional franchises in terms of player compensation and maybe even facilities and support staff.
Competing for talent.
Yes. For athletes who aren't necessarily on the fast track to the NFL or NBA, or who play sports with less lucrative pro options, think WNBA, MLS, many Olympic sports, staying in college longer, earning good money, might be a very attractive alternative to a marginal pro career or playing overseas.
Yeah.
In that sense, college becomes a more direct competitor for that tier of talent.
But for the absolute top draft picks.
For the elite, blue-chip prospects, destined for top pro leagues, college probably remains the primary feeder system, just a much more lucrative one now. The key differences are still that formal employee status and the power of collective bargaining in the pro leagues.
So in a weird way, college sports is now like a giant laboratory for the pros. A beta test.
You could definitely see it that way. This whole new system in college, the direct pay model, the NIL clearinghouse, the roster management changes, how competitive balance plays out. It's like a large-scale beta test for different ways of structuring sports economics and talent development.
And the pro leagues will be watching closely.
Absolutely. They'll be watching to see what works, what fails, what unintended consequences pop up. Does the NIL clearinghouse actually work? How does direct pay impact recruiting and parity? What happens to non-revenue sports? The successes and failures in college could provide valuable lessons for pro leagues' own future planning.
Okay, so let's try to bring it all together. We've got this massive shift. On one side, athletes are finally getting compensated in a way that reflects their value in this huge industry, which many feel is long overdue justice.
Right, a recognition of their economic contributions.
But on the other side, you have the universities, the athletic departments, facing enormous financial pressures, complex new regulations, major legal uncertainties, and potentially having to cut sports or opportunities. Plus, concerns about the traditional college aspect fading away.
That really captures the fundamental tension here. It's a collision between recognizing athlete rights and value and the immense operational, financial, and legal challenges this new model imposes on the institutions.
And that debate we mentioned, does this finally bring stability, or does it just open Pandora's box to a whole new level of chaos and uncertainty? That seems far from settled.
Far from it. The ink is barely dry on the settlement approval, and the biggest questions remain unanswered.
So just to recap the journey, we've seen the end-of-the-century-old amateurism model. We have the start of direct athlete pay through the back pay fund and the new capped revenue sharing. We have regulated third-party NIL deals, major shifts in who governs college sports, and a completely new financial landscape.
But hanging over all of that are these massive looming uncertainties, the incredibly complex path to Title IX compliance in this pay structure, the huge unresolved legal battle over whether athletes are or will become employees, the antitrust cloud hanging over the payment cap itself, The very real financial strain, especially outside the Cower Four, and the precarious future for many non-revenue sports and the Olympic athletes they produce.
So, given all those moving pieces, all the legal fights still brewing, the sheer scale of this transformation, are we really on that pathway to begin stabilizing college sports like NCAA President Baker hopes? Or is this just chapter one of an even more unpredictable, maybe unrecognizable future for college athletics?
It really forces you and everyone involved to ask a fundamental question. What does college sports even mean in this new world? What will it look like 5, 10 years from now?